אני מאוד נרגשת להציג את פרופסור קרלוס מונטיירו. פרופסור מונטיירו הוא אחד החוקרים הבולטים בעולם בתחום התזונה ובריאות הציבור, והוא זה שטבע את המונח מזון אולטרה מעובד. הוא פיתח את סיווג הנובה, שבאמת הפך היום לדרך שבה אנחנו מבינים את ההשפעות של עיבוד על הבריאות שלנו. הוא חבר, לא שומעים כל כך טוב, שומעים אותי, כן? הוא חבר בוועדה של ה-Eat Lancet 2025, והוא גם הוביל סדרת מאמרים בלנסט על מזון אולטרה מעובד, שראתה אור השנה, הוא ידבר על זה, והוא מצטרף אלינו בזום מסן פאולו, ואני עכשיו יעבור ברשותכם לאנגלית. So we are truly honored to have you, Professor Monteiro, to open this event. Thank you for joining us today, live from São Paulo. Professor Monteiro is an emeritus professor at the School of Public Health at the University of São Paulo. He is one of the world's leading authorities on nutrition and public health. He is the scientist who coined the term ultra-processed food and developed the NOVA classification, which has transformed the way we understand food processing and its impact on health. Professor Monteiro was a commissioner of the Eat Lancet Commission 2025 and led the Lancet series on ultra-processed food and human health, also launched in 2025. His keynote today is titled Ultra-Processed Food and Health Evidence, the Misleading Narrative of Healthy Ultra-Processed Foods and Policy Implications. Professor Monteiro, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction. And let me start by sharing my slides. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can you see it? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I have two remarks to make before I start the presentation. First, that although I was author of the two Lancet publications on the Eat Lancet report and UPF Lancet series, I focused my presentation in the Lancet UPF series, right? Because I know that you discussed the Lancet E report in the other subsequent presentations. A second remark is that unfortunately I won't be able to be with you the rest of the meeting because I have a medical appointment I could not postpone. So basically, I will review the evidence linking ultra-processed foods and health. Then we see, based on the Lancet, the first paper of the Lancet series on UPF and human health. Then we'll see the misleading narrative of health UPFs, and then we'll explore policy implications. So starting with the evidence. The strongest evidence showing that consuming more UPF increases the risk of diseases comes from a systematic review we did for the Lancet series on every cohort studies that has assessed the association between the share of UPFs in the diet and any chronic disease outcomes. We found 104 studies. They were published in the last 10 years. They were conducted in all continents except Africa. They include a large number of participants, more than 10,000, sometimes more than 100,000, 10 years median follow-up, average follow-up. And it was very important. The quality assessed by the Newcastle-Ottawa scale showed that 85 studies were considered a high quality by this scale. So this means these studies had a very good control of confounders, low proportion of misclassification of exposure or outcomes, etc., etc. The important thing is that 92 of these 104 studies show an increased risk of one or more chronic diseases outcomes across nearly all organ systems, from the brain to the guts. Next, what we did, what is usually done when you do a systematic review, is to do meta-analysis. And we did meta-analysis for studies that on outcomes that we found at least 4 or more studies, right? So here you see the result of the meta-analysis showing that when we compare high versus low consumption of ultra-processed foods, we have increase in several diseases: gastrointestinal diseases, cardiovascular diseases, kidney, diabetes, dyslipidemia, mental diseases, depression, all-cause mortality. So again, spanning all organ systems. Of course, these studies were observational, so then we cannot infer causality automatically. We need to examine these studies under the length of the Bradford-Hill criteria for causation. And what we observed was that these studies that I'm shown before, they fulfill all relevant Bradford-Hill criteria for causation. Consistency, the studies were conducted in different countries, different researchers, different methods show similar findings. Strength, the magnitude of risk is similar to the protection associated with the Mediterranean diet. Temporality, all were prospective studies. Biological gradient, dose response association in most studies. Coherence, the association does not conflict with the natural history and biology of the diseases. And plausibility and experiment. In the case of, these are very important criteria for causality. In the case of plausibility, as you see in a moment, many chronic disease-related aspects of diet quality are affected by UPF consumption. So it's biological plausible that UPF causes these diseases. And as you see in a moment, there's experimental evidence, randomized control trials in the case of obesity in particular. One second. I have difficulties. Yeah. I cannot move my slides, but just one second. Okay. Okay. So the first mechanism linking UPF consumption with diseases, chronic diseases, is nutrient imbalances. Ultra-processed foods are grossly nutrient imbalanced. So these one meta-analysis of 13 national dietary surveys has shown that the more UPF is consumed in these 13 countries, the higher the content of added sugar, saturated fat, total fat, and the lower the content of fiber, protein, and potassium. So this is the perfect storm for chronic diseases. But this is not the only mechanism, plausible mechanism. We have also evidence that the more ultra-processed fat consumed, the lower the content of bioactive compounds in the diet, like flavonoids, for instance. The higher the toxic compounds produced by processing or released from packaging materials. There's also evidence that the more UPF in the diet, the higher the amount, the absolute amount of additives, harmful additives, additives for which we have evidence of harmfulness in terms of health, and mixtures of these additives, which are also related with diabetes, CVD, etc. There's also evidence that the more UPF is consumed, the overall diet has an excessive energy content. So we have excessive energy intake that lead to weight and fat gain. In this case, as I said before, We have 4 randomized control trials and 2 community trials showing this. And finally, one specific new RCT has shown that the ultra-processed diets, they have high energy density and hyperpalatability, and this leads to excessive energy intake and weight and fat gain. Equally important for policy, the same UPF dietary share, which is causing disease, is rising globally. Here you see the trends for 9 countries for which we have 3 or more repeated comparable national dietary surveys. So you see that's very clear that everywhere the share of UPF is increasing. In countries as China that start the series with a very low consumption, the increase is steeper. And then, for instance, in China, in 15 years, the share of UPFs in the diet, the national share of UPF in the diet, went from 3 to 10% in 15 years. You see trends, increasing trends also in Latin America, in countries in Europe, in Asia, and in countries like the US, where the UPFs already correspond to most of the calories that are consumed, more than 50%, then you see a slower increase, but you still see an increase. This increases dietary share of UPF is confirmed by UPF sales in 93 countries from 2007 to 2022. So you can see that in low income, lower middle, upper middle income countries, the sales of all these UPF subgroups that you see here in the slides, they increase. We have some stability in high income countries, but this is due only to a decline specifically in one UPF subgroup, which are soda, and increase compensated by increases in other UPF subgroups. Of course, this is clearly related to the fact that this subgroup, soda, has been targeted by policies in many high-income countries. The conclusion of the first paper in the UPF, Lancet UPF series, is that despite the research gaps that, of course, they exist, only we need more research. But despite these gaps, evidence on UPF harms and trends warrants urgent national and global policies to halt and reverse their production and consumption. Not everybody agrees with this, I have to tell you. And people that still don't think it's time to act, to have policies to reduce UPF production and consumption, the main argument they use is what we call the misleading narrative of healthy UPFs. This narrative argues that not all UPFs are unhealthy and that based on nutrient profile, some may be healthy, some neutral, and some even healthy. In other words, it claims that the UPF concept is useless for understanding the relationship between diet and health. It's not. And why it's not? First of all, because although UPFs vary in their nutrient profiles, of course, a soda is very different from a fiber-added ultra-processed food. But robust evidence, as I showed to you before, show that nutrient balance is not the only UPF attribute affecting diet quality and disease risk. We have harmful additives, we have packaging materials, we have a lack of bioactive compounds, etc., etc. Second, UPFs impact health as a dietary pattern, the same way the dietary Mediterranean diet affects health, or through the cumulative effect of substituting non-UPFs with their UPFs counterparts. So when we see the dietary share of UPF associated with so many diseases, is because part of these non-UPFs, like water, is being replaced by soda or whole grain, really whole grain bread, processed breads replaced by fiber-added whole grain bread, etc., etc. Therefore, what matters is not a variation within UPFs on the line, but comparisons with their non-UPF counterparts. So the problem is here. Is soda less healthy than water? Is breakfast cereals less healthy than steel-cut oats, etc., etc.? So when you consider not just the nutrient profile, but if we consider all the relevant food attributes of UPFs, UPF versions are always potentially less healthy. So the fiber added whole grain bread is certainly less healthy than a soda, but is more healthy than a soda, but is less healthy than a real processed whole grain bread. Which substitutions are more harmful? Of course, this is a very important question, and it could be important for policy design. The problem is that we that work with nutrition epidemiology, we know that it's very difficult to assess observationally the association between specific foods like soda versus water or whole grain bread versus ultra processed versus processed bread, etc. And this is because, first of all, the variability is low when you take people consuming soda and water. The difference you see is much smaller than the difference for the all UPF consumption, right? Second, the exposure misclassification is more likely when you see specific foods. Residual confounding also, we have the problem of multiple testing. So it's very likely that if we want to know if, let's say, a frozen lasagna, ultra processed, and a homemade lasagna are how different they are in terms of health, we need randomized control trials. But okay, so the healthy UPFs pretend that there are evidence and the observational evidence that support their argument. Here's the first study based on the Harvard cohorts that assessed the association with UPF subgroups and one disease, in this case, diabetes. The same study, they show, as many other studies, that the more UPF is consumed, the higher the diabetes risk. But what about UPF subgroups? That's a question they asked. 5 of these UPF subgroups, those in red, they increase the risk of diabetes, as the overall UPF consumption does. But 4 UPF subgroups protect against diabetes. They prevent diabetes. Which are these 4 food subgroups, UPF subgroups? First, desserts and sweet snacks and packaged savory snacks, which really it's not consistent with the criterion of a coherence of Bradford-Hill causality. But they also include whole grain bread and yogurt and daily based desserts. Whole grain bread and yogurts are often used as example of healthy UPFs. Are they really healthy? So, not at all. And why is that? Because this analysis, as other analysis of UPF subgroups, they assess the association using inappropriate comparators. So, for instance, a strawberry flavor, the intake of a strawberry flavored yogurt is compared with the intake not of plain yogurt with strawberries, that as we could expect, but with the average no UPF. The same thing for fiber added whole grain bread. It's not compared with processed bread, but it's compared with the average no UPF. But it's still more important is the fact that in this analysis, the associations are not adjusted for obvious confounders. We all know that people that consume yogurt or whole grain bread, regardless if they are ultra processed or not, they tend to consume more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, and this was not adjusted in these studies. To make matters worse, the doubtful health effects shown by UPF subgroup associations differ across outcomes. taking the example of yogurts and using only papers based on the Harvard cohorts. We see that the yogurt, we conclude by these studies that yogurt would prevent diabetes, type 2 diabetes and CVD, had no effect on stroke and CVD mortality, and were associated with higher risk of frailty, Parkinson, and all-cause mortality. In short, the healthy UPF narrative lacks theoretical and empirical support, yet, unfortunately, has been used to delay recommendations aimed at preventing the replacement of fresh meals, minimally processed foods, and fresh meals with UPFs, and to limit regulation solely to the HFSS foods, high fatty, salty, sugary foods. What are the policy implications of this evidence? First, despite research, as we conclude in the Lancet series, despite research gaps, evidence on UPF harms and trends warrants urgent national and global policy to halt and reverse overall UPF production and consumption. These policies should include dietary guidelines recommending unprocessed or minimally processed foods and fresh prepared meals over UPFs, as we have in Brazil, as you have also in Israel, and there are more other 15 countries. We also need restriction on UPF marketing. In many countries, there are restrictions in high fatty, salty, sugary food, which is very good, but we need to expand these to UPFs. We also need UPF warning labels and UPF free school meals. While no UPF is inherently healthy, as I showed to you before, interim regulatory policies may exempt not healthy UPFs because they don't exist conceptually, but specific UPFs that in some contexts are important sources of lacking nutrients when immediate affordable alternatives are unavailable, of no UPF are unavailable. And this is the way that this discussion is being done in the US. They are, as you know, the new government in the US is the new dietary guidelines in the US recommend reduction in UPF consumption. And the discussion now is that because in the US, most foods are ultra processed, it would be impossible to target all UPFs at the same time. So then they are looking for ways to exempt some UPFs. And one possibility is to exempt packaged foods that qualify for the FDA health claim. What's more important for this meeting is that interim regulatory policy may also exempt ultra-processed plant-based substitutes for animal-sourced foods with great environmental impact as red meat. But to do this, it's important that the substitution effectively lowers environmental impact. And this is clear in the case of some substitutes for red meat, but not for eggs and milk, for instance. We need more evidence on this. It's also important to assure that this substitution is beneficial or at least neutral to health. And finally, which is still more important, it's important that in this specific context, immediate, affordable, non-UPF alternatives as whole grains, legumes, and nuts, in the case of substitution of meat, are unavailable. This situation applies to the US, on where people don't cook, no longer cook, so really eating real food is almost only the elite in the US still consume real food. So in this situation, this could apply. Not in Brazil, for instance. In Brazil, legume beans is part of the staple food. We don't need these plant-based burgers, which are ultra processed, of course. to reduce consumption. We can just shift people from eating more meat to eating less red meat and more beans, for instance. Finally, foods for special medical purpose, like tube feeding formulas, infant formulas, also should be exempted because they are subject to specific regulations. Wow, that's what I had to tell you today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Monteiro. I hope you heard the applause. I can really again say how much I think we all appreciate your work on ultra-processed food, on the NOVA classification, and your leadership is really very much appreciated.
Thank you.
So thank you very
and
much.
I hope next time we have
to
more
Hebrew
time
now.
to discuss. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.